they are someone. And unlike a desk or a chair or a podium, they have interests. They have things that are important to them, and we talked about some of those things earlier today. I talked about mink and how they have an interest in swimming. They have an interest in being alone. Those are very powerful needs that they have as individuals in a way that a desk or a chair doesn't have needs. They don't need anything. And that is basically the change that we're trying to bring about in the world. We want to have this shift in how people, in the attitude that people have about animals. Take it from being, these are things, this is property, this is something, and make it, this is an individual. This individual has rights, they have interests, they have needs, they are someone. Now, that's how we want to change the world, and it seems like a lot. But I want to look back at history and at times where this attitude has been maybe prevalent about other groups of individuals who haven't been seen as important. So I'm from the US, so I know a lot about US history, so I'm going to be using that as my sort of talking point. But basically we can look at the history of our society as sort of the spreading of what I like to call the circle of compassion. Basically like who's in the circle and who's not. Who matters and who doesn't. Whose interests do we take seriously and who do we ignore. Now 150 years ago in the US, where I'm from, the rights of black citizens were recognized for the very first time. They weren't even citizens before then. If you had a poll of any white person on the street in America 150 years ago and you had said, do black people have rights? The vast majority of them would have said, no, they don't. It was common wisdom, it was universally accepted more or less. Now obviously we look back at that today and we think this is just like the most ridiculous, absurd, offensive thing that you could ever possibly imagine. But it wasn't that long ago where that was the overwhelming, predominant view. And the people who felt differently were in a very small minority, and nobody had any interest in what they had to say about it. 100 years ago, in America, in the United States, we first recognized the rights of female citizens in terms of their right to vote. Before 100 years ago, and there are people who are alive today, who were alive back then, not a lot of them, but this was not that long ago in terms of the history of our society, when basically half of the country, most of the people in this room were viewed as like so irrational and crazy that they couldn't participate in government. I mean, you think about this now, it's completely absurd, right? I mean, again, it's this offensive, totally outdated, it's something that it's an opinion you wouldn't give in polite society. You would not say that to anybody and, oh, I don't believe women should have a right to vote, and expect that they wouldn't, like, scream at you. I would hope so, anyway. I would. I bet most of you in this room would. And yet that was only 100 years ago that this was completely and totally accepted, and people didn't even give it a second thought. So today, if you poll people on the street, if you ask people what they think, do animals have rights? Unfortunately, most people probably wouldn't agree with this. But we can look back at history and see that it doesn't take that long, in the grand scheme of things, for these things to change. And you know what? They're changing right now. And we're watching it happen. Now, how do we know this? Well, look at the people who have power, right? And who has power in our society these days? Well, it's corporations, right? I mean, let's just be honest about it. That's who runs the show. That's who has the power. That's who's kind of churning the wheels. And you can look at major corporations like McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's. Not the good guys, by any stretch of the imagination. But even these corporations, who are basically slaughtering and profiting off the torture and deaths of millions upon millions of animals every single year, even these companies are starting to recognize that you have to take little steps here and there to recognize the rights and the interests of animals. Those companies have all taken very small steps towards doing that. Things like phasing out the use of gestation crates for pregnant pigs, like we talked about earlier. It's a very small percentage and it's happening very slowly, but it's happening. These companies are saying, okay, this is something that's important. This is something that we need to address. You can look at companies like J. Crew, or Wet Seal, or Forever 21, which have all banned fur from their stores. These are clothing companies that are selling to young women. And they have decided that, you know what, no, we're not going to sell fur, even though, honestly, there are people who would buy it. They could make money doing that. And they have chosen not to do it. You can even look at nations. Nations like Great Britain and Austria have banned fur farming from their countries. And Germany has even amended the constitution of their nation to include animal rights as something that the Constitution of Germany protects. It's in the language of their constitution, right next to where it talks about human rights. It talks about animal rights as being protected by the nation of Germany. I've been doing this for about 15 years, which is not as long as some people in this room, but I feel like it's a pretty long time. And if you had told me that 15 years ago, that there would be a major first world nation that would have animal rights written into the constitution of their country, I would have told you that you were nuts. I would have told you you were insane. And I would have been wrong, thankfully. It wouldn't be the first time. But this is huge progress in a very short amount of time. It is baffling how quickly things are changing. 10 years ago, hopefully none of you had to go through this, but you couldn't buy soy milk in the grocery store. You had to get it in these like little shelf-stable cartons. I see a lot of people going like, yeah, I remember that. But it was like nasty and it tasted like chalk and it was disgusting and you had to like drive 3 towns over to get it. Now you can get it at like Walmart. I mean, this is huge progress in terms of the acceptance of these ideas that we're talking about. But they all have one thing. I mean, they're very different things that we're talking about, you know, farm animal improvements and not selling fur, countries adding animal rights to their constitution. They're all very different. But what they have in common is they show people in power, whether not just people, but governments, corporations, those who have power are choosing, not because they have to, but because they want to, for whatever reason. And I'm not going to say that they're not selfish reasons possibly, but for whatever reason, they're willingly making the choice to recognize and respect the rights of animals. Sometimes in very small ways or in very incremental ways. But as somebody who has studied this stuff, and I know a lot of you guys probably have as well, that's where it starts. And when it's the people who have the power who start to give it up willingly, that's when you know you got something going on.